Snow whipped through Dead Crow's Hollow like the breath of vengeful spirits, each gust carrying the metallic tang of gold dust and the acrid bite of wood smoke from a dozen chimneys. The wind found every gap in the ramshackle buildings that clung to the mountainside with the desperation of men who had staked everything on dreams of easy fortune. On this bitter February morning in 1876, the dreams had curdled into something darker. The town square was little more than a patch of frozen mud between the largest buildings, McKendry's mining company office, Hutchinson's saloon, and the general store that doubled as post office. Despite the bone-deep cold that turned breath to ice crystals, a crowd had gathered with the grim anticipation that preceded either justice or barbarism. In places where law meant whatever the man with the most guns said it meant. Tallulah knelt in the center of this human circle, her wrists bound behind her back, with coarse hemp rope that bit through the threadbare wool of her gray dress. The blindfold across her eyes was fashioned from black cloth, so thick it pressed against her temples like a vice, creating a darkness so complete it seemed to have weight. Blood trickled from a gash on her left cheek, where she had stumbled on the ice-slick steps of Horatio's boarding house, her stepfather's heavy hand shoving her forward when she had hesitated at the threshold of what she knew would be public humiliation. The curse must remain covered. Horatio Blackthorn's voice boomed across the square, each word weighted with the authority he had spent a decade cultivating through fear and fabricated righteousness. At 53, he was a bear of a man, his black beard streaked with premature gray from years of mountain winters, his pale blue eyes holding the cold certainty of someone who had convinced himself that his lies were divine truth, lest its evil spread to contaminate the innocent souls of this godly community. The crowd pressed closer, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. Miners shifted restlessly in boots that had seen too many seasons, their faces weathered by wind and underground dust, until they looked carved from the same granite that surrounded their workings. Townspeople huddled in whatever warm clothing they possessed, patched coats, threadbare shawls, hats, with holes that let in more cold than they kept out. Some watched with the morbid fascination of those hungry for any spectacle to break the monotony of frontier survival. But others seemed uncomfortable with the proceedings, their expressions troubled by doubts they dared not voice aloud in Horatio's presence. Moving through the gathered people with practiced stealth was a figure that most dismissed as harmless Elias the Trapper. They called him a ragged man in patched canvas trousers and a wool shirt so frayed it barely held together. His slouch hat was pulled low over eyes that appeared perpetually dulled by drink, and he swayed slightly as he walked, reinforcing the impression of a man weakened by too many nights seeking solace in whatever rot-gut whiskey he could afford on trapper's wages. But beneath the carefully constructed facade, Elon Redfeather moved with the fluid grace of a Lakota warrior, trained from childhood in the arts of hunting and war. Every step was calculated, every gesture deliberate, every stumble precisely choreographed to maintain his disguise. His fingers brushed unconsciously against the hawk feather talisman hidden beneath his collar, a sacred reminder of the vision quest that had revealed his path as a protector of his people, and a seeker of justice for wrongs that cried out to the spirits for vengeance. For 3 months he had lived this degrading charade, watching and waiting, gathering evidence of the systematic crimes being committed against lands guaranteed to the Lakota by solemn treaty. Each morning, he had awakened in a flea-ridden cot in the boarding house's cellar, forced to share space with drunks and drifters, while he sharpened other men's knives and traps for a few copper coins. Each evening, he had shuffled through the saloon, nursing watered-down whiskey, while listening to conversations that revealed the depth of corruption in Dead Crow's Hollow. He had watched McKendry's guards beat miners who complained about working conditions. He had seen children barely old enough to hold a pickaxe sent into the most dangerous shafts because their small bodies could fit through narrow passages. He had observed the systematic intimidation of anyone who asked questions about federal mining permits or tribal land rights. And through it all, He had maintained his disguise, playing the harmless drunk, while fury burned in his chest, like banked coals waiting for wind to fan them into flame. But it was the treatment of the girl that had finally cracked his warrior's discipline. For weeks he had watched Horatio parade her through town in her blindfold, using her supposed curse to reinforce his religious authority, while ensuring that she could never identify the faces that went with the voices she overheard in his house. The cruelty was casual and comprehensive, designed not just to control her, but to demonstrate to everyone what happened to those who defied the established order. As he positioned himself behind the kneeling girl, Elin felt his warrior's instincts cataloging every threat in the square. Sheriff Cheever stood near the saloon entrance, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that appeared relaxed, but positioned him to draw and fire within seconds. Two deputies flanked the crowd with rifles held at ready positions, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of trouble. McKendry's hired guards were scattered throughout the gathering professional killers who had learned their trade in range wars and mining disputes where violence was simply another business expense. But it was the girl herself who commanded his attention and stirred something deeper than tactical assessment. Even bound and blindfolded, even with blood staining her pale cheek, she maintained a dignity that spoke of inner strength, unbroken by years of systematic persecution. Her breathing was controlled despite what must be overwhelming fear, and she held her head high with defiance that her stepfather had been unable to crush through a decade of physical and psychological abuse. Ilan's gloved hand moved toward the knot securing her blindfold, his movements so subtle that none of the watchers noticed his approach. The rope was tied with deliberate cruelty, pulled tight enough to leave red marks on her skin and create pressure that must have been causing constant pain. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, his voice so low that only she could hear. The words were spoken in careful English, but beneath them lay the cadence of his native tongue. "The morning star still watches over us." The phrase was not random. It was a traditional Lakota blessing for those facing darkness, a reminder that even in the deepest night dawn would eventually come. He doubted she would understand its cultural significance. But something in his tone, a gentleness that had been absent from her world for longer than she could remember, made her shoulders relax fractionally beneath their burden of fear. Then the rifle shot split the morning air like thunder rolling down from the mountain peaks. The bullet splintered the wooden post beside them, sending fragments of frozen pine spraying across the square like shrapnel. Ilan's body immediately moved to shield Tallulah, his broad shoulders creating a barrier between her and the shooter, while his fingers worked frantically at the blindfold knot. Training and instinct had taken over, transforming the apparent drunkard into something far more dangerous in the space between one heartbeat and the next. A miner near Hutchinson's saloon was already reloading his face, twisted with the kind of fear that transformed ordinary men into killers. His eyes were wild with the superstitious terror that Horatio had so carefully cultivated, and spittle flew from his lips as he screamed, "The curse, it's already starting to spread. We've got to stop it before it kills us all." Other voices joined his, a rising chorus of panic that threatened to transform the crowd into a mob driven by hysteria rather than reason. But Ilan's attention remained focused on the knot beneath his fingers, each movement precise, despite the chaos erupting around them. The rope had been tied by someone who took pleasure in causing pain, layered and twisted in ways designed to be both secure and agonizing. "Stay calm," he murmured to Tallulah, feeling the tremor that ran through her slight frame as violence began to escalate around them. "I'm going to get you out of this, but I need you to trust me completely." His palm cupped the back of her neck as he worked the final threads loose the contact, sending an unexpected jolt of warmth through both of them. For Tallulah, it was the first gentle human touch she had experienced in years for Ilan. It was the moment he realized that his mission had become something far more personal than gathering intelligence or seeking vengeance for his murdered cousins. The blindfold fell away. Just as Horatio pushed through the crowd, a heavy oak cudgel gripped in his massive fist. His face was purple with rage, the careful control he usually maintained over his emotions shattered by this unexpected challenge to his authority. Spittle flew from his lips as he bellowed commands that were lost in the wind. "The curse must remain covered," he roared, raising the club above his head, like some Old Testament patriarch calling down divine wrath. "Remove that blindfold and doom us all to perdition and suffering beyond imagining." But it was too late. Tallulah's face was revealed to the winter light for the first time in years. Not the grotesque horror Horatio had described in his sermons, but the pale, drawn features of a young woman whose gray eyes were clouded with cataracts that caught the weak sunlight like frosted glass. There was nothing supernatural or threatening about her appearance, only the evidence of medical neglect and systematic abuse. The crowd fell silent as the reality of what they were seeing penetrated their fear-conditioned minds. Some of the men shuffled backward, shame beginning to replace terror on their weathered faces as they realized they had been party to the persecution of someone who posed no threat to anyone. Others leaned forward with curiosity rather than fear, studying features they had been told were too dangerous to look upon. A few of the women in the crowd began to weep, recognizing in Tallulah's condition the fate that could befall any of them if they fell afoul of the men who controlled their community. The systematic oppression of the blind girl had served as an object lesson for all of them. Step out of line, ask too many questions, challenge authority in any way, and you too might find yourself kneeling in the snow with a rope around your neck. The miner raised his rifle again, but before he could fire, Dr. Alma Klein's voice cut through the tension with the authority of someone accustomed to taking command in crisis situations. "Enough of this madness." The physician pushed through the crowd, her medical bag clutched in one hand, and her chin raised in professional defiance that had been forged in the crucible of a dozen frontier emergencies. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence that came from having studied at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania during the era when most people believed women had no place in medicine, and from having saved lives in conditions that would have broken lesser spirits. Horatio's face darkened further, his knuckles white as he gripped the cudgel with hands that trembled from rage rather than cold. "You have no authority here, woman. Return to your needlework and tea parties and leave spiritual matters to those qualified by God and training to address them. I am qualified to recognize medical conditions when I see them." Dr. Klein shot back her voice, carrying the weight of education and experience that had been hard-won in a world determined to deny both to members of her sex. "And what I see here is a clear case of cataracts clouding of the eye's natural lens that can be treated with proper surgical intervention." The word surgery rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water, creating concentric circles of whispered discussion and nervous glances. Some of the older residents crossed themselves, viewing such medical intervention as blasphemous defiance of God's will, while others leaned forward with newfound hope that perhaps the curse they had all feared was nothing more than a treatable medical condition. Silas McKendry chose that moment to make his entrance, emerging from behind his personal bodyguards with the calculated timing of a man accustomed to controlling both situations and people. His gold pocket watch chain glinted in the pale sunlight, and his sharp features held the cold calculation of someone who counted profits in human misery and viewed every crisis as an opportunity to consolidate power. "Perhaps we should all take a step back and allow cooler heads to prevail," he said in the smooth, reasonable tone that had served him well in business negotiations from St. Louis to San Francisco. "Dr. Klein, would you be so kind as to escort the young lady to your surgery for a more comprehensive examination. I'm sure we can resolve this matter to everyone's satisfaction without further public spectacle." It seemed like a generous suggestion, even enlightened by the standards of frontier justice. But Elin caught the subtle signal McKendry gave to Sheriff Cheever, a slight nod toward the town's eastern edge that promised action away from public scrutiny. The lawman's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his sidearm, while the hired guards began shifting positions to control potential escape routes and eliminate witnesses to whatever was planned. "I'll be happy to help carry her medical supplies." Alon offered his voice, still maintaining the drunk act, while his eyes remained alert to every developing threat in the square. The transformation from harmless trapper to protective warrior was so subtle that only the most observant watchers might have noticed the change in his posture and the way his hand had moved closer to the knife hidden beneath his ragged coat. As they prepared to leave the square, Tallulah felt terror and hope warring in her chest, like opposing armies fighting for control of contested territory. The possibility that her blindness might not be permanent seemed too incredible to believe after 10 years of living in darkness, yet Dr. Klein's confident diagnosis carried the weight of scientific knowledge rather than superstitious fear. "Is it really true?" she whispered to the physician as they began walking through the snow-packed streets of Dead Crow's Hollow, her voice barely audible above the wind that carried the sound of mining operations from the mountain slopes above them. "Can you actually help me see again?" "I can attempt the procedure," Dr. Klein replied with the professional honesty that medical ethics demanded, even when false hope might have been kinder. Cataract extraction by needle or knife is a known surgical technique, but it carries significant risks under any circumstances. In frontier conditions with limited equipment and no trained assistant, those dangers are multiplied considerably. But looking at your eyes in proper light, I believe there's reason for cautious optimism. Aelin walked slightly behind, and to one side of the two women, every warrior instinct alert to potential ambush points and escape routes. Dead Crow's Hollow had been poorly planned, its narrow streets and dead-end alleys, creating perfect conditions for trapping unwary victims. Too many shadows offered concealment for enemies, while the steep mountainsides limited options for rapid retreat if violence erupted. The town itself bore the ugly scars of greed and haste that characterized most mining boom settlements. Buildings had been thrown up with whatever materials were available, green lumber that warped in the first winter tar paper that leaked in every stormstone foundations that shifted with the freeze-thaw cycles. Nothing had been built to last, because everyone expected to get rich quick and move on to more comfortable surroundings. The result was a community that looked temporary, even after several years of existence, as if it might blow away in the next strong wind. But as he observed their surroundings with tactical precision, Aelin found himself admiring more than just Tallulah's survival skills. There was something indomitable in her bearing, as she navigated the treacherous footing with her walking stick, tapping out a path she had memorized through years of careful practice. Despite everything that had been done to break her spirit, she moved through the world with dignity and purpose that spoke of inner strength that no amount of persecution had been able to crush. When she stumbled slightly on a patch of ice hidden beneath fresh snow, Aelin moved instinctively to steady her, his hand briefly touching her elbow through the threadbare wool of her coat. The contact was electric, a moment of connection that neither could fully explain, but both felt with startling intensity. For just an instant, the careful walls they had both built around their hearts to protect themselves from a hostile world seemed to become transparent. "Thank you," she murmured, the simple words carrying more emotional weight than elaborate speeches of gratitude. In those two syllables lay acknowledgement, not just of immediate assistance, but of the recognition that someone had finally chosen to treat her as a human being, worthy of protection rather than a problem to be managed or eliminated. Their destination was Dr. Klein's surgery, a well-equipped room attached to her modest residence on the town's outskirts. The physician had established her practice in Dead Crow's Hollow, not because she was attracted to the mining boom, but because frontier communities were often the only places where a female doctor could find patients willing to overlook her gender in exchange for competent medical care. She had arrived 3 years earlier, following reports that the previous doctor had died in a mining accident that many suspected was actually murder committed to silence someone who had asked too many questions about working conditions. But as they approached the building that represented their only hope of medical intervention, Aylin's heightened senses detected movement in the shadows between buildings, armed men positioning themselves to intercept their small party before any treatment could begin. The trap was closing with mechanical precision, but the prey was more dangerous than the hunters realized. Sheriff Cheever stepped out from behind Morrison's feed and supplied his badge glinting dully in the overcast light that filtered through the winter clouds. 2 deputies flanked him with rifles held in deceptively casual positions that fooled no one familiar with frontier violence. All 3 men had the hard-eyed look of individuals who had crossed moral lines too many times to worry about their soul's salvation. "That's far enough." Cheever called out his voice, carrying the authority of his office while being undermined by the obvious reluctance in his tone. He was a man caught between competing loyalties paid by McKendry to maintain order that served business interests, but still bound by some vestige of legal duty that made him uncomfortable with outright murder in broad daylight. Dr. Klein stopped walking, but showed no intention of retreating or surrendering her patient. "What is the meaning of this, Sheriff? I am providing medical care to someone who desperately needs treatment for a condition I am qualified to address." "Direct orders from Mr. McKendry." Cheever replied, his eyes avoiding her steady gaze in a way that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with his instructions. "The young lady is to be returned to Blackthorn's custody immediately. This whole business about surgery is dangerous foolishness that could get innocent people hurt and disrupt the peace of our community." Elon felt Tallulah's breathing quicken with fear as the reality of their situation became clear. But beneath the terror, he sensed something else, a growing anger at years of imprisonment and systematic abuse that had been justified by lies and superstition. For the first time in her adult life, she had been offered genuine hope of escape from the darkness that had defined her existence, and she was not going to surrender that hope without a fight. "I won't go back," Tallulah said quietly, but her words carried across the frozen street with crystalline clarity that cut through the wind like a blade through silk. "I want to see what the world actually looks like, not live forever in the darkness Horatio has kept me trapped inside." It was a simple declaration, but it represented a fundamental shift from passive acceptance to active resistance. For the first time in a decade, she had voiced her own desires rather than submitting to her stepfather's version of divine will. The transformation was as dramatic as if she had suddenly grown wings and announced her intention to fly to the moon. Cheever shifted uncomfortably in his boots, his hand moving closer to his gun belt in a gesture that suggested he was prepared to enforce McKendry's will through violence, if necessary. "Now, miss, you don't want to make this situation more difficult than it needs to be. Your stepfather has legal guardianship over you according to territorial law, and Mr. McKendry has the community's best interests at heart in all his decisions." "Whose interests?" Dr. Klein demanded with professional indignation that had been honed through years of fighting for respect in a male-dominated profession. Certainly not those of a young woman who deserves proper medical treatment for what appears to be a completely treatable condition. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring under maximum tension. Elon calculated distances and angles with a warrior's precision, his hand moving incrementally closer to the knife hidden beneath his ragged coat. But violence here would expose his true identity and endanger both women he had sworn to protect. He needed a distraction, something that would give them a chance to escape, without revealing that the harmless drunk was actually a trained killer. That distraction came from an unexpected source, when Ephraim Doolin's voice cut through the tension like an axe splitting seasoned kindling. "Sheriff!" The farmer called urgently from his position near a loaded supply sledge, his weathered face showing the kind of alarm that suggested immediate crisis. "Emergency down at the main shaft. Cave-in has trapped more than a dozen men underground. And they need every available hand right now if there's any hope of getting them out alive." The lie was delivered with such conviction and apparent sincerity that Cheever immediately turned toward the mine complex, his deputy instincts overriding his mercenary obligations. Years of experience had conditioned him to respond to mining emergencies without question, because cave-ins were the kind of disaster that could claim dozens of lives if rescue efforts were delayed even by minutes. In that crucial moment of distraction, Elan made his move with the fluid precision of a hunting cat striking at unwary prey. "This way," he whispered urgently, guiding Tallulah toward Ephraim's sledge, while Dr. Klein gathered her essential medical supplies with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency situations. Ephraim's weathered eyes met Elan's for just an instant, and something passed between them, a recognition that this confrontation had grown beyond personal grievances to encompass the very soul of their community. There was more to the farmer than his simple exterior suggested, a depth of understanding that hinted at experiences and knowledge that extended far beyond tending crops and trapping animals for winter fur. "Take the river road," Ephraim murmured as they climbed into the sledge, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew the territory better than most. "Ice has been thick for 3 weeks solid, and it'll get you clear of town before they realize what's happened and organize proper pursuit." As the sledge began moving, pulled by 2 sturdy horses accustomed to frontier conditions and heavy loads, Tallulah felt the rough wood of the seat beneath her hands and smelled the familiar scents of leather harness and winter air sharp with the promise of more snow. But everything seemed different now, charged with both possibility and mortal danger in equal measure. For the first time in years, she was moving toward an uncertain future, rather than enduring an unchanging present. Elan took the reins with movements that betrayed his true competence, despite the carefully maintained drunk act. As the sledge picked up speed on the snow-packed road that led toward the river, he felt Tallulah's shoulder bump against his when they hit rough patches in the track. These moments of contact seemed to anchor them both in the swirling uncertainty of their desperate flight, providing a physical reminder that they were no longer facing their challenges alone. "Hold tight to this," he said gruffly, placing a heated brick wrapped in wool cloth into her frozen hands. The warmth spread through her numb fingers like a blessing, but it was the gentle way he guided her hands to the makeshift warmer that made her pulse quicken with something more complex than simple fear. Behind them, Dead Crow's Hollow receded into the gray distance, like a fever dream that was finally breaking. But the danger was far from over. Horatio's rage would be terrible when he discovered Tallulah's escape, and McKendry had too much invested in maintaining control of the territory to let them simply disappear into the wilderness. The manhunt that would follow would be systematic and ruthless, employing every resource at their disposal to eliminate witnesses to crimes that reached far beyond simple mining fraud. But for the first time in 10 years, Tallulah was moving toward light rather than away from it. And that simple fact gave her courage she had never known she possessed. The future might be uncertain and filled with mortal peril, but it was her future to face, rather than a fate imposed upon her by others' cruelty and greed. The pursuit came faster than even Elan's tactical pessimism had anticipated, the sound of hoofbeats on packed snow echoing across the frozen landscape like drumbeats announcing the approach of an army. He pushed their horses as hard as he dared, but the sledge was heavy with supplies and passengers, while the snow was deep enough to slow their progress significantly, despite the well-traveled road. 3 riders. Tallulah observed her acute hearing, picking up details that escaped her companions, even as they strained to assess their situation. The lead horse is laboring already, probably Cheever's mount. It's been favoring its left foreleg ever since it stepped in that prairie dog hole near Henderson's claim last week. Aylin glanced at her with growing respect and amazement that bordered on awe. Her blindness had indeed sharpened her other senses to an extraordinary degree, transforming what others might consider a disability into a tactical advantage that could mean the difference between escape and capture. She was providing intelligence that his own trained warrior senses had missed, proving herself an invaluable ally rather than merely someone who needed protection. "Mar, how far back are they?" he asked, guiding their horses toward the river crossing, where the ice would provide better footing and potentially faster travel than the snow-laden road. She tilted her head at precisely the angle that would capture sound waves most efficiently, her expression intense with concentration as she sorted through the auditory information reaching her enhanced senses. 1/4 mile, maybe slightly less. But they're pushing their mounts too hard for these conditions, dangerous strategy on uncertain ice that could cost them everything if they're not careful. As if summoned by her prophetic words, the sharp crack of breaking ice echoed across the frozen wasteland like a gunshot. One of the pursuing horses had broken through a section of river ice that appeared solid from the surface, but had been weakened by underwater currents. The riders' shouts of alarm carried clearly in the brittle air as man and animal struggled in water cold enough to kill within minutes. Elan made a split-second tactical decision, pulling their sledge toward the far bank, where deeper snow would muffle their tracks and provide some concealment from rifle fire. But even as they reached the temporary safety of the opposite shore, Cheever and his remaining deputy appeared at the river's edge, with their weapons already trained on the fleeing party. "Stop right there," Cheever commanded, his voice carrying a note of desperation that suggested McKendry's instructions had been very specific about acceptable outcomes. "Mr. McKendry wants this handled quiet and peaceful if possible, but he'll accept loud and final if that's what the situation requires." The threat was as explicit as a loaded gun pointed at their heads: surrender immediately, or face the consequences of defying the most powerful man in the territory. But Elan had not endured months of degrading disguise and systematic humiliation, only to be stopped by corrupt lawmen whose loyalty could be purchased with mining company scrip. Instead of complying with the sheriff's demand, he cut the leather traces that connected the sledge to their horses, then pulled both women to safety behind a fallen tree just as rifle fire erupted from across the river. The shots splintered bark and sent snow cascading from overhead branches, missing their intended targets by mere inches, but demonstrating that Cheever was prepared to use lethal force to complete his mission. Dr. Klein threw herself behind a granite boulder, her medical bag clutched protectively against her chest as bullets whined through the air above their heads. The supplies inside that bag represented years of careful accumulation, irreplaceable tools for practicing medicine in a place where the nearest alternative treatment was hundreds of miles away across mountain passes that were impassable for months at a time. Elan drew his knife and prepared to make what might be their final stand against superior numbers and firepower. But Tallulah had other plans that demonstrated the kind of quick thinking that had kept her alive through years of systematic persecution. Using her steel-tipped walking stick with the precision of a trained weapon, she struck out at the legs of their panicked horses, causing the animals to rear and bolt directly toward the deputy's position on the opposite bank. The terrified horses created enough confusion and distraction for Elan to retrieve Dr. Klein's precious medical chest and pull both women toward the tree line that offered concealment and multiple escape routes. But even as they reached temporary safety, Cheever's desperate shot found its mark with a bullet creasing Elan's left shoulder and sending blood streaming down his arm to stain the snow at their feet. "You're hit." Tallulah set her hand, finding the wound with unerring accuracy despite her blindness and the chaos surrounding them. "Just a graze," he replied through gritted teeth, though she could feel the warmth of blood soaking through his coat and detect the tremor of pain in his voice that he was trying to hide. The injury was more serious than he wanted to admit, but there was no time for proper medical attention with armed pursuit still active. The trek through knee-deep snow was brutal, each step requiring tremendous effort from people already exhausted by fear and desperate flight. The temperature was dropping as the weak winter sun disappeared behind gathering storm clouds, and the wind was picking up in a way that promised more snow before nightfall. When Tallulah began to falter, her limited physical strength sapped by cold and the emotional toll of their escape, Elon lifted her without hesitation, despite his wounded shoulder. She felt the solid strength of his arms beneath her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the determined set of his jaw against her cheek. In that moment, pressed against his chest, with his heart beating strong and sure beneath her ear, she experienced something she had never felt before. In her life, absolute trust in another human being's commitment to her welfare and safety. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice rough with effort, and something deeper that neither of them yet had adequate words to express. "Nothing's going to happen to you while I'm alive to prevent it." The promise was simple in its language, but profound in its implications, resonating through her entire being, like the first note of a song she had been waiting her whole life to hear. For someone who had spent years wondering if anyone in the world cared whether she lived or died, the certainty in his voice was more precious than any treasure McKendry had ever pulled from his illegal mines. Behind them, Ephraim Doolin emerged from his winter trap line like a ghost materializing from the forest shadows. The farmer had witnessed the pursuit and its violent conclusion, and his weathered face showed the kind of grim determination that suggested he had finally chosen a side in the conflict that was tearing their community apart. For months, his conscience had been wrestling with itself, torn between self-preservation and moral duty, as he watched Dead Crow's Hollow sink deeper into corruption and systematic violence. He had loans from McKendry's company that kept his farm afloat, debts that could be called in at any moment if he stepped out of line. But seeing Tallulah's courage in the face of overwhelming odds had finally tipped the balance toward action rather than passive complicity. Working quickly with the efficiency of someone accustomed to setting trap lines in sub-zero conditions, he placed several of his steel-jawed beaver traps across the most likely pursuit routes, disguising them with fresh snow and natural debris. The traps were designed to catch animals much smaller than horses, but they would serve their purpose of slowing down or injuring any mounted pursuit. When Cheever's remaining deputy followed their trail on foot, leading his horse through the dangerous terrain, the animal stepped directly into one of the concealed traps. The steel jaws closed with bone-crushing force, breaking the horse's leg and throwing its rider heavily to the ground, where he lay stunned and bleeding in a snowbank. The delay would cost Ephraim dearly when McKendry discovered his interference. But some principles were worth more than financial security or personal safety. As he helped the injured deputy to basic shelter and medical attention, Ephraim knew he had finally chosen the right side in a conflict that had been eating at his soul for too long. But as he worked to stop the bleeding from the deputy's head wound, something caught his attention, a glint of metal in the weak sunlight that didn't belong to standard law enforcement equipment. Hidden beneath the injured man's coat was a small badge different from the territorial sheriff's department insignia. The design was federal, marking its bearer as a United States Marshal operating under deep cover. Ephraim's eyes narrowed as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. The deputy he was treating was not one of McKendry's corrupt enforcers, but a federal agent who had been investigating the mining company's operations from within. The manhunt that had just taken place was not law enforcement pursuing criminals, but criminals pursuing the law. This changed everything and Ephraim knew that his role in the unfolding drama was far from over. The evidence that Elan and the others were carrying would be invaluable, but it needed to reach the right hands to be effective. And now he knew exactly whose hands those were. The cave system where Elan led his small party stretched deep into the mountainside. Like the throat of some sleeping giant, a network of natural chambers and passages that had been expanded by earlier mining efforts and then abandoned when the ore played out. Multiple branching tunnels, stable rock formations, and entrance points that could be easily defended made what had been worthless for mining nearly perfect for concealment. The original prospectors had left behind evidence of their efforts. Rusted tools, rotting timber supports, and chambers where equipment had been stored during active operations. But nature had begun to reclaim the workings with ice formations, creating natural barriers, and wildlife establishing territory in the deeper recesses, where human presence was rare. Elan led them through the labyrinthine darkness with the confidence of someone who had spent months mapping every tunnel and chamber during his intelligence-gathering mission. His hand on Tallulah's elbow guided her steps with gentle precision, while Dr. Klein followed closely behind her precious medical supplies, protected against her chest like a mother shielding her child. "How much further?" The physician whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the narrow confines of the passage they were traversing. "Just ahead." Elan replied quietly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from intimate knowledge of the terrain. "There's a natural chamber where the original miners stored their equipment and supplies. It's dry, easily defendable, and has 3 separate exit routes if we need them for emergency escape." As they settled into their underground sanctuary, the full reality of their situation began to crystallize with sobering clarity. They were now fugitives from what passed for territorial law, hunted by men with unlimited financial resources and few moral constraints about the methods they employed. The comfortable facade of civilization that Dead Crow's Hollow had maintained was stripped away, revealing the brutal reality of frontier justice, where might made right and the strongest survived. But their seemingly desperate position also offered some unexpected advantages that became apparent as the hours passed. While they had been making their desperate escape, other players in the unfolding drama had been taking actions that would prove crucial to their ultimate survival. Jonas Pike, the mild-mannered schoolteacher, who had always seemed more concerned with proper penmanship than politics, had been using his after-hours access to the schoolhouse for purposes that went far beyond grading papers and preparing lessons. McKendry's office was located in the same building complex, and the thin walls that separated education from commerce had allowed Jonas to overhear conversations that revealed the true scope of the mining company's criminal activities. More importantly, McKendry's arrogance had led him to store sensitive documents in what he considered secure locations, never imagining that a simple schoolteacher might possess both the courage and the skills necessary to access them. Jonas had been systematically copying pages from private ledgers and business correspondence, creating a documentary record of crimes that extended far beyond simple mining fraud. His neat teacher's handwriting had recorded a comprehensive catalog of systematic exploitation miners paid in worthless company scrip instead of legal currency. Children as young as 10, forced to work in dangerous conditions that violated even the minimal labor protections of territorial law, and a complex web of bribery that reached from local officials all the way to federal appointments in Washington. But most significantly, Jonas had discovered evidence of murders that McKendry had ordered to protect his illegal operations. The federal inspector, whose accidental drowning had been attributed to a fishing mishap, was only the most recent in a series of suspicious deaths involving anyone who had threatened to expose the systematic violations of tribal land rights and federal mining regulations. "I've copied everything I could safely access," Jonas explained when he arrived at the tunnel entrance shortly after midnight, his school satchel bulging with stolen documents that represented months of dangerous work. But McKendry is becoming suspicious of my presence in the building after regular hours. He's started posting armed guards around his office and personal residence, and I'm afraid my usefulness as an intelligence source may be coming to an end. Ilan examined the papers by lamplight, his expression growing darker with each page he read. These were not merely individual crimes committed by greedy men seeking quick profits, but systematic violations of federal law that represented a comprehensive assault on the sovereignty and survival of his people. "This confirms everything I suspected and more," he said grimly, his voice carrying the accumulated weight of months of investigation and the anger of a warrior who had finally found proof of the injustices he had witnessed. McKendry isn't just stealing gold from tribal lands. In violation of federal treaties, he's planning massive expansion operations come spring. Railroad construction, heavy mining equipment, hundreds of additional workers. He means to strip mine the entire Sacred Valley before anyone in Washington realizes what's happening and takes action to stop him. The implications were staggering in their scope and ambition. What had begun as individual greed and opportunistic crime had metastasized into a comprehensive plan to destroy the Lakota way of life in the Black Hills region. McKendry's vision extended far beyond simple mining profits to encompass the creation of a personal empire built on stolen land and enforced through systematic violence. Tallulah listened to their discussion with growing understanding of the vast forces that had shaped her personal imprisonment and suffering. Horatio's decade of calculated cruelty had not been random sadism or religious fanaticism, but an essential component of a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen gold and fraudulent land claims. Her blindness and isolation had served to protect secrets that implicated powerful men in crimes that could result in federal prosecution and lengthy prison sentences. "There's something else you need to know," she said quietly. Her bandaged eyes turned toward the group with an intensity they could feel, even though they could not see her expression. "Something I've never told anyone because I thought no one would believe the testimony of a blind girl with no social standing or legal rights." The conversation stopped abruptly as everyone in the chamber focused their complete attention on her words, sensing that she was about to reveal information of crucial importance. 3 nights before Horatio blinded me with the lie, I overheard him talking with McKendry about a federal inspector who had been asking uncomfortable questions about mining permits and tribal treaty rights. They were planning to offer him a substantial bribe to overlook any irregularities he might have discovered, but if that approach failed to secure his cooperation. She paused, gathering the courage necessary to voice what she had carried alone for 10 years. They discussed making him disappear permanently, like they had done with other troublesome officials in the past. Dr. Klein leaned forward intently, her medical training making her appreciate the significance of precise testimony and accurate memory. "Are you saying they have systematically murdered federal representatives who threatened their operations?" "I'm saying they talked about it like it was routine business practice," Tallulah replied, with quiet conviction that carried more weight than dramatic proclamations. They discussed methods, timing, and ways to make deaths appear accidental. And exactly 3 days after that conversation, Inspector Morrison's body was found in the river below the main bridge, supposedly the victim of a tragic fishing accident. This revelation cast their desperate situation in an entirely new and far more dangerous light. If McKendry was willing to murder federal officials to protect his operations, eliminating a blind girl and her protectors would pose no moral obstacles whatsoever. They were not dealing with simple criminals seeking profit, but with men who had crossed every conceivable line and would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But the information also provided them with evidence of federal crimes that could bring the full authority of the United States government down on the corrupt mining enterprise with devastating force. Murder of federal officials was not a territorial matter to be handled by local courts, but a federal crime that would attract the attention of the highest levels of law enforcement. We need to get this information to someone with the power and authority to act on it. Elan said, his tactical mind already working through the possibilities and obstacles that lay ahead. But who can we trust when the corruption appears to reach so high into the territorial administration? The answer to his question arrived in the form of Ephraim Doolin's weathered face appearing at the tunnel entrance. But the farmer was not alone. He was supporting another man, someone whose features were partially obscured by bandages and dried blood, but whose bearing suggested authority and competence, despite his obvious injuries. "Been searching for you people since before dawn," Ephraim said without preamble, his breath forming clouds in the cold air as he helped his companion into the chamber. "Found this gentleman on my trap line wounded, but very much alive and very interested in having a conversation with all of you." The stranger straightened as much as his injuries allowed, and his hand moved to his coat to reveal a badge that gleamed in the lamplight, not the territorial sheriff's insignia they had expected, but the federal marshal's star that represented the authority of the United States government. Marshal James Crawford. He introduced himself, his voice hoarse from cold and injury, but carrying unmistakable authority. "I've been investigating McKendry's operations for the past 6 months, working under deep cover as one of his security men. What you people have accomplished in the past few days has provided more solid evidence than I've been able to gather in half a year of dangerous work." The revelation transformed their understanding of recent events completely. The deputy who had been pursuing them was actually a federal agent trying to protect them from McKendry's real enforcers. The manhunt they had escaped was not law enforcement chasing criminals, but criminals trying to eliminate federal investigators. "McKendry knows I'm here now." Crawford continued, accepting the cup of heated broth that Dr. Klein prepared for him. "My cover was blown when I tried to prevent his men from capturing you at the doctor's surgery. He's planning something big for tonight. Word is, he's going to eliminate all potential witnesses and destroy any physical evidence that could implicate him in federal crimes." Ephraim nodded grimly. "That matches what I've been hearing in town. McKendry's brought in additional men from outside the territory, professional killers who don't have any local connections or loyalties. He's planning to clean house completely before more federal investigators arrive." "How long do we have?" Elan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Not long," Crawford replied. "Federal cavalry is en route from Fort Robinson, but they won't arrive for at least another day, maybe 2 if the weather turns bad. McKendry knows this, and he's planning to present them with a fait accompli, all witnesses dead, all evidence destroyed, and a story about tragic mining accidents that claimed multiple lives." The timeline had suddenly compressed from days to hours. Everything now depended on surviving until federal reinforcements arrived, while simultaneously protecting the evidence that could bring justice for years of systematic crimes. "There's something else," Tallulah said, her voice carrying the kind of determination that made everyone focus their complete attention on her, despite the crisis surrounding them. "I've been creating something over the years, a memory system that Horatio always dismissed as the harmless handicraft of a simple-minded girl." She reached into her coat with careful precision and withdrew what appeared to be a long string of seemingly random objects, buttons of various sizes and materials, smooth pebbles collected from different locations, pieces of carved wood in distinctive shapes, scraps of different metals, all connected by thread, salvaged from old clothing, and knotted in complex patterns that held meaning only to their creator. Each item represents specific information I overheard during the years I lived in Horatio's house. She explained, her fingers moving along the improvised memory device, with the practiced ease of someone who had spent countless hours perfecting her system. Conversations between him and McKendry, dates when particular events occurred, Amounts of money that changed hands, names of officials who received bribes, threats made against potential witnesses. I developed a tactile coding system so I wouldn't forget important details over the passage of time. Dr. Klein examined the ingenious memory aid with professional admiration for its creativity and systematic organization. Remarkable work. You've essentially created a tactile mnemonic cord, using whatever materials were available to you, encoding complex information in a format that couldn't be detected or understood by your captors. Can you decode all of the information stored in this device? Jonas asked his scholarly instincts, immediately recognizing the potential value of such a comprehensive record of criminal activities. Tallulah nodded the movement, hidden by the protective bandages that still covered her healing eyes. Every significant conversation I overheard between Horatio and McKendry over the past several years, every bribe payment they discussed, every threat they made against potential witnesses, every detail about their plans for expanding operations and eliminating opposition. It's all encoded in this system if we can correlate the information with the dates and financial amounts recorded in the documents Jonas copied. The work began immediately, with Tallulah translating her tactile code while Jonas cross-referenced dates and financial amounts in the stolen ledgers. Marshal Crawford contributed his own intelligence about McKendry's operations, while Dr. Klein documented medical evidence of systematic abuse and deliberate injury. What emerged from their collaboration was a comprehensive picture of corruption that reached far beyond simple mining fraud into the realm of systematic federal crimes. McKendry had been paying regular bribes to territorial officials, federal inspectors, and military officers to ignore treaty violations and overlook the deaths of both white miners and Lakota warriors. The 3 tribal members who had been killed the previous summer had not died in a random skirmish over land rights, but in a carefully planned ambush designed to eliminate their protests about sacred burial grounds being desecrated by heavy mining equipment. Most damning of all was evidence of the planned railroad expansion that would effectively steal millions of acres of tribal land through the use of forged federal permits and systematically bribed officials. McKendry's spring construction project represented not just expanded mining operations, but the complete destruction of the Lakota way of life in the Black Hills region. This evidence could hang McKendry and bring down half the territorial government. Marshal Crawford said with grim satisfaction as he reviewed their compiled documentation. But only if we can get it to federal authorities who have the power and jurisdiction to act on these crimes. What about the cavalry unit you mentioned? Elin asked. Can they provide the protection we need until proper legal proceedings can be initiated? Crawford's expression grew troubled. That's assuming they arrive in time and that McKendry doesn't succeed in his plan to eliminate all witnesses and evidence before they get here. He's not going to wait passively for federal troops to arrive and arrest him. Tonight, he's going to try to end this permanently. As if summoned by the marshal's ominous words, the sound of distant explosions began echoing through the mountain valleys, carried on the wind like thunder rolling across the peaks. But these were not natural phenomena. They were the systematic detonations of mining charges being set off in patterns that suggested deliberate destruction rather than routine excavation work. He started, Crawford said grimly. McKendry is destroying the evidence of his illegal mining operations, collapsing tunnels and burying equipment that could implicate him in treaty violations. And once he's finished with that, the implication hung in the air like smoke from the distant explosions. Once McKendry had eliminated the physical evidence of his crimes, he would turn his attention to the human witnesses who could still testify against him. Their hidden sanctuary in the abandoned mine workings would not remain secret for long, and with professional trackers and killers systematically searching every possible hiding place in the territory. But even as their situation appeared increasingly desperate, Tallulah felt a profound transformation occurring within her sense of identity and purpose. The frightened, dependent girl who had knelt blindfolded in the town square was being replaced by someone stronger and more determined, someone capable of fighting for justice, rather than merely surviving systematic persecution. The most dangerous phase of their ordeal was about to begin. And when it came, it would test not just their physical courage and tactical skills, but the emotional bonds that had formed between them in the crucible of shared mortal danger. As the explosions grew closer and the sound of men's voices could be heard echoing through the tunnel system, Elan began making preparations for what might be their final stand. But Tallulah reached out and caught his arm, her touch gentle but insistent. "There's another way," she said quietly. "The old flooded section that the miners abandoned when they hit the underground spring. The water is ice-cold and dangerous, but it connects to natural cave systems that McKendry's men don't know about. If we can survive the crossing, we can reach the surface at a location where they won't expect us to emerge." It was a desperate gamble that could kill them as surely as McKendry's bullets, but it offered their only realistic hope of escaping the trap that was closing around them. And for Tallulah, who had spent so many years trapped in darkness, the prospect of risking everything for a chance at freedom held no terror, only the promise of finally taking control of her own destiny. The flooded tunnels were exactly as treacherous as Tallulah had warned, filled with water so cold it numbed exposed skin within seconds and threatened hypothermia to anyone who spent more than a few minutes immersed in its icy embrace. The passage led through natural cave formations that predated human presence in the mountains, carved by underground streams that had found their way through solid rock over countless centuries. They waded through the frigid water with Elan supporting both women, his superior physical strength and cold weather endurance. The only thing keeping them functional in temperatures that could prove fatal within minutes. Dr. Klein's medical bag was held high above the water level, its contents too precious to risk, despite the personal danger involved in protecting them. Behind them, the tunnel system they had abandoned shook with increasingly powerful explosions as McKendry's demolition plan proceeded with systematic efficiency. The sound of falling rock and collapsing passages echoed through the flooded chambers like the death cries of some ancient beast being systematically destroyed. "Under there," Tallulah said through chattering teeth, pointing toward what appeared to be nothing more than solid rock, but was actually a narrow opening between natural formations. "Light. I can see actual daylight filtering through that passage." The words carried wonder that transcended their desperate circumstances and physical discomfort. Despite everything they had endured, the surgery, the explosions, the icy water that threatened to claim their lives, she could actually distinguish between the bright promise of approaching daylight and the deep shadows of the cave interior. They squeezed through the opening just as the final charges detonated in the tunnel system behind them, bringing down entire sections of the mountain in a cascade of falling stone and screaming metal. The explosion created a towering column of dust and debris that rose hundreds of feet into the winter sky, visible for miles across the snow-covered landscape. Emerging onto a narrow mountainside ledge, they found themselves with a commanding view of the entire Dead Crow's Hollow region spread out below them. McKendry's mining operations were clearly visible, along with the systematic destruction that was eliminating evidence of illegal activities. But they could also see something else that made Elan's heart leap with sudden hope, a column of blue-uniformed cavalry approaching from the eastern pass, their regimental guidon snapping proudly in the mountain wind. Federal authority had finally arrived, drawn by Marshal Crawford's earlier reports and the evidence that Ephraim had managed to deliver to military commanders at Fort Robinson. The timing was almost miraculous, arriving just as McKendry's final solution was being implemented. But even as hope flared in their hearts, disaster struck with the precision of a well-aimed rifle shot. The bullet came from somewhere below their exposed position, and Elan felt the projectile crease his already injured shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling toward the edge of the precipice. Tallulah lunged forward without conscious thought, her hands closing around his wrist, just as he began to fall into the abyss that yawned beneath them. The sudden weight nearly pulled her over the edge as well, but she braced her feet against a solid rock outcropping and held on with strength, born of absolute desperation and determination. "I've got you," she gasped, echoing his earlier promise with fierce conviction. "I won't let you fall no matter what it costs me." But their position was precarious beyond description, and the shooter below was already reloading for a second more carefully aimed shot. Worse still, the sound of angry voices in the destroyed tunnel system behind them suggested that some of McKendry's men had survived the explosions and were working their way toward the surface through alternate routes. It was in this moment of ultimate crisis that Tallulah made a decision that would test the limits of her newly restored vision. Using her free hand, she worked frantically at the knots, holding her protective eye bandages in place, pulling the cloth away, despite Dr. Klein's warnings about protecting her healing eyes from bright light and potential damage. The world that greeted her partially restored sight was a blur of overwhelming colors and painful brightness that made her eyes water and sent stabbing pains through her skull. But it was also beautiful beyond any description her childhood memories could have preserved. And more importantly, it was clear enough to serve her desperate purpose. She could see Elan's face with startling clarity for the first time since they had met, noting the strength and determination in his features, along with the pain and exhaustion that marked their shared ordeal. She could see the vast landscape spread out below them like a painting of impossible grandeur. And she could see the rotten timber supports that held up the mine's main trestle bridge spanning the gorge beneath them. Those ancient wood supports had been weakened by years of weather and the constant vibration from mining operations. They would never bear significant additional weight if stressed in precisely the right location, and Tallulah's years of navigating by sound and memory had given her an uncanny ability to judge distances and trajectories. Her throwing skills developed through years of moving through darkness and identifying objects by touch and sound had never been more critically important. The smooth stone she selected and hurled at the weakened support beam struck its target with accuracy that would have impressed trained marksmen, and the deteriorated wood gave way with a crack like thunder rolling across the mountain peaks. The bridge collapsed in a cascade of splintering timber and screaming metal, carrying with it the figure who had emerged from the smoke and destruction, below not one of McKendry's hired gunmen, but Horatio Blackthorne himself, somehow having survived his earlier fall into the river and made his way back through sheer force of obsessive hatred for a final confrontation with his escaped victim. His screams of rage and frustration were cut short as the collapsing bridge carried him down into the rocky gorge below, this time with no possibility of survival or miraculous escape. The man who had tormented Tallulah for a decade had finally met a fate that matched his cruelty, destroyed by the very infrastructure of greed and corruption that he had helped to build and maintain. As the echoes of destruction faded across the mountain valley, federal marshals and cavalry troopers swarmed through the mining complex with military precision and efficiency. Their legal authority was finally being brought to bear on a place that had known only corruption and systematic violence for far too many years. McKendry's carefully constructed criminal empire began crumbling within hours of the federal intervention, built as it was on lies and murder that could not withstand exposure to proper legal investigation. The network of bribed officials and intimidated witnesses collapsed like a house of cards when confronted with documentary evidence and eyewitness testimony that could not be dismissed or suppressed. Marshal Crawford, despite his injuries, took personal charge of the investigation and arrests that followed. His months of undercover work had given him intimate knowledge of the criminal organization's structure and operations, while the evidence provided by Tallulah Jonas and Elan filled in gaps that would have taken months of additional investigation to uncover. This case is going to bring down half the territorial administration and several federal appointees as well," Crawford admitted as he reviewed their compiled documentation. McKendry was paying systematic bribes to judges, army officers, Indian agents, territorial legislators, and even some congressional staff members. The entire governmental structure in this region was corrupted from foundation to roof beam. Justice, when it finally arrived, proved both swift and comprehensive in its scope. McKendry was arrested on federal charges that would keep him imprisoned for the remainder of his natural life, while his co-conspirators faced similar fates as their careers and reputations were destroyed by their own documented greed and casual disregard for human life. Sheriff Cheever, confronted with overwhelming evidence of his corruption and complicity in multiple murders, resigned his office in disgrace and fled the territory before federal warrants could be served. The smaller players in the conspiracy either confessed their crimes and cooperated with investigators in hope of reduced sentences, or found themselves facing federal grand juries that had no patience for frontier lawlessness disguised as legitimate business enterprise. But for Tallulah, the most important moment came 7 days after their escape from the collapsing mine, when Dr. Klein carefully removed the remaining bandages from her left eye in a proper medical facility established by the federal investigators. The world that greeted her restored vision was initially a blur of overwhelming colors and painful brightness, but gradually resolved into images of startling beauty and clarity. She could see Elan's face with perfect detail, young and strong, marked by the kind of quiet dignity that spoke of deep convictions and unshakable personal courage. She could see the mountain peaks, painted in shades of gold and crimson by sunset light, could see stars emerging in the clear winter sky like diamonds scattered across dark velvet. The sun, she whispered in wonder, looking toward the western horizon where the day's light was painting the landscape in colors she had forgotten existed. "It's more beautiful than I ever dared imagine it could be." His hand touched her cheek with infinite gentleness, and she saw tears in his dark eyes, tears of relief and joy, but also something deeper and more complex that neither of them yet had adequate words to express. "You can see," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of miracles made manifest through human courage, determination, and the kind of love that could bridge any divide when founded on mutual respect and proven through shared adversity. The months that followed were filled with legal proceedings, testimony before federal investigators, and the slow process of rebuilding their lives in the aftermath of systematic corruption's exposure and destruction. Dead Crow's Hollow itself withered and died as a community, its population scattering to seek opportunities elsewhere once the illegal mining operations were permanently shut down. Dr. Klein established a thriving new medical practice in a legitimate settlement 50 miles south, where her skills were genuinely appreciated and her courage in exposing the conspiracy made her a respected figure in the territorial medical community. Jonas Pike received an appointment with the Territorial Education Department, his meticulous documentation efforts having impressed officials who valued precision, moral courage, and dedication to justice over personal advancement. Ephraim Doolin used the substantial reward money from exposing the criminal conspiracy to pay off all his debts and start fresh on a homestead where his family could prosper without the shadow of corruption and violence hanging over their daily existence. But for Tallulah and Elan, the future proved far more complex than simple happy endings that ignored the real obstacles they would face. The barriers between their worlds had not disappeared with McKendry's defeat and the restoration of federal law to the territory. She remained a white woman in a society that viewed interracial relationships with deep suspicion and often violent hostility, while he was still a Lakota warrior whose people desperately needed his leadership during increasingly difficult times. The federal government's intervention had indeed shut down the illegal mining operations and returned portions of the sacred Black Hills to tribal control. But larger pressures continued to build as more white settlers arrived each month seeking their own fortunes in gold land and the opportunities that territorial expansion seemed to promise. The Treaty of Fort Laramie had been upheld in this specific case, but its long-term survival remained uncertain in the face of continuing westward expansion. Yet, as they stood together on the hill overlooking the ruins of Dead Crow's Hollow 6 months later, watching the spring sun set over mountains that would remain in Lakota hands because of their combined efforts, they made promises that transcended the social limitations others tried to impose upon them. When the warm season truly arrives, I must return to my people, Elan said quietly, his voice carrying both duty and regret in equal measure. There are tribal councils to attend decisions to be made about how we respond to continued encroachment on our ancestral lands. The fight we won here was just one battle in a much larger war for survival. But if you're willing to face the difficulties that such a choice would bring, there might be a place for you in our world as well. Tallulah's response came without hesitation or doubt, spoken with the conviction of someone who had already counted the cost and found it acceptable. I've spent 10 years living in darkness because I was too afraid to speak truth to those who held power over me. I refuse to spend the rest of my life in a different kind of darkness because I'm afraid to follow what my heart knows to be right. Their foreheads touched in the traditional Lakota gesture of binding commitment, a sacred promise that bridged cultural differences and challenged social conventions with quiet determination. It was not a fairy tale ending that ignored real obstacles and genuine difficulties, but something more valuable. A realistic foundation for building a life together despite the significant challenges they would certainly face in the years ahead. Learning Lakota customs and language would require years of dedicated effort and patience. Tallulah would need to prove herself worthy of acceptance by a people who had every reason to distrust white promises and motivations, having been betrayed too many times by those who spoke of friendship while planning theft and destruction. The children they might have would face questions of identity and belonging in a world that increasingly demanded people choose sides rather than finding ways to bridge differences. But they had already proven that some bonds were stronger than the forces that tried to break them, and that love founded on mutual respect and tested through shared adversity could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable to those who had never faced such challenges. 1 year later, Tallulah stood in the Lakota village that had become her home, watching her husband return from a successful hunt while their infant daughter slept peacefully in the cradle board that tribal women had taught her to make. The journey to acceptance had not been easy. There had been those who questioned Elan's choice and challenged her right to live among them. But gradually, through demonstrated commitment to their ways and genuine respect for their culture, she had earned a place in the community that was based on contribution rather than tolerance. The medical knowledge she had gained from Dr. Klein proved valuable in treating injuries and illnesses, while her fluency in English and German made her useful in negotiations with traders and government officials. The women who had initially viewed her with suspicion now sought her advice about matters both practical and personal. The elders who had questioned Elan's wisdom now acknowledged her contributions to community welfare and the strength of character she had demonstrated through adversity. When their first child was born, a daughter with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin, she was welcomed not as a half-breed outsider, but as a full member of the tribe, raised to understand both sides of her heritage as sources of strength rather than division. She will see the world clearly, Elan said, holding his daughter while Tallulah recovered from childbirth with the assistance of tribal women who had become her sisters in all but blood. With both eyes open, understanding all the colors of life and all the shadows that give them meaning. Tallulah smiled with the joy of someone who had found peace. After years of struggle, her restored vision, allowing her to see every detail of her daughter's perfect face. She agreed with quiet confidence. And she'll never have to choose between the love that created her and the world that surrounds her. She'll know that strength comes from embracing all parts of who she is, not from denying any of them. Their little girl would grow up speaking 3 languages, English, German, and Lakota, understanding that identity could be complex without being contradictory. She would know her grandmother's lullabies and her father's warrior songs, her mother's stories of survival, and her people's legends of sacred places and spiritual journeys. 5 years after their escape from Dead Crow's Hollow, as Tallulah watched her daughter play with other children in the village, while her son napped peacefully against her chest, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from blindness to sight, from imprisonment to freedom, from isolation to belonging, in a community that valued her contributions. The scars around her eyes had faded, but never disappeared, completely permanent reminders of the cruelty she had survived and overcome. But they had also become symbols of transformation, proof that even the worst injuries could heal when treated with skill and love, and that strength could emerge from the deepest suffering when supported by courage and determination. Elaine returned from a successful trading expedition as evening settled over the mountains and their eyes met across the village, with the understanding that came from years of shared challenges and mutual support. They had built something precious together, not just personal happiness, but a living example that bridges could be constructed between worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. That night, as they sat by their fire, with children sleeping safely nearby, Tallulah looked up at stars she had learned to name in Lakota, and spoke words that carried the weight of everything they had gained and everything they had become. "The morning star still watches over us," she said, using the phrase he had whispered in that terrible moment, when she knelt blindfolded in the snow, not knowing that her life was about to change forever. "And always will," he replied, taking her scarred hand in his, and feeling the strength that had grown from surviving trials that would have broken weaker spirits. Those scars, like the ones around her eyes, had become symbols of transformation, marks of bondage that had become reminders of freedom earned through courage and love that had proved stronger than hatred and fear. Their story had begun in darkness and desperation, but it continued in light and hope, sustained by the knowledge that they had helped bring justice to a place where it had been absent too long. If their children grew up understanding that love could bridge any divide when founded on respect and sustained by commitment to something greater than personal comfort, then all their struggles would have served a purpose that extended far beyond their individual happiness. The sun had indeed returned to her world, bringing with it everything beautiful and precious that made life worth living, even when that life required courage to defend and wisdom to preserve.